Greetings, fellow mechaniacs and non-orc hobbyists, and welcome to another episode of Sork's Mech Shop. Today we're going to be talking about how to paint using a full-on oil workflow. It's a topic we haven't covered yet on this channel, and I hope you're going to enjoy it. I've gotten a few questions on how to use oils beyond just washes a few times from some of my friends, and so I thought I'd cover it today by taking our Spiritseer that we've used in previous episodes and doing his robes up using nothing but oil paints. Why did we pick this for the demo? Well, the robes offer us an opportunity to demonstrate one of oil paint's greatest strengths, which is extremely smooth transitions. Oil paints are, in my opinion, much better than acrylic paints for doing smooth transitions because they really give you those nice long working times. You can really get a nice buttery transition between one color and another color as you work across the model, and hopefully you'll see that in the demonstration. But without going any further, let me talk to you first about a few key points on working with oils. The first one, as I mentioned before, you have some really, really long working times, like for example, hours or even days, depending on what medium you're using and how thick you're putting your oil on. Second, unlike acrylics, where you're pretty much just adding more paint to the model, with oils, you can continuously add paint and subtract paint until you get exactly what you want out of your artwork. Third, a little goes a long way. I've had the same tubes of oil paint for probably a decade or more now, and when working with miniatures especially, just a tiny little bit on your brush will go a long way. I usually wind up not being able to squeeze out of the tube the amount I'm using for a particular model without like actually having to throw some away, just because the volume squeeze out of the tube is too much for any given model. So when you're putting that onto your model, you want to make sure that you're not putting too much onto the model, because again, that drying time is going to increase the more you put on there. So squeeze as little as you can out to work with, and then on the brush itself, you're going to do as little as possible and work in very, very small increments on the model itself. Fourth, blending in general is preferred to layering when it comes to oils, at least to me. Obviously, there's a lot of different brush techniques you can use, but when it comes to miniature painting especially, I find that working with oils, I really want to use blending a lot more, and I don't necessarily want to stack layers and layers of oil up more than absolutely necessary. And then finally, if you do layer, you want to remember that the oil principles of fat over lean and lean over fat. What that means, and it's kind of a term that canvas artists use a lot. What it means is that if you have two layers of oil that are sort of the same thickness of oil or the same density of oil, then they're going to kind of merge together. Whereas if you actually want to put one layer on top of the other so that it is actually opaque compared to the one that's underneath it, you need to vary the density of that oil, if that makes sense. So like if you start with a thin layer, which I usually do, I start with a thin layer and then I add thickness as I go up, then like I said, you're going to have a slightly thicker layer on top of it in order to actually cover the layer underneath. Conversely, once you've done that, if you want to go back in and go with a thinner layer to, for example, do a wash or to do a glaze or filter, that sort of thing, then you will be able to do that and cover it up with a thinner layer. But again, if you have the exact same layer or pretty close to the same layer density, then it's just not going to work very well. It's just going to get muddy, and so you don't want to do that. So again, fat over lean, lean over fat. So now, just as a quick overview to the technique, and again, I'll do this step by step as we go through the demo, but I want to give you a quick overview just because it is very different from the way you would do a normal acrylic, or I shouldn't say normal, but the way you do an acrylic paint job using your miniature paints that you're used to. First thing you're going to do is you're going to paint with whatever color you select, and I would recommend usually starting off with a slightly darker color than what you want the end result to be. You paint it, then you wipe it off. Not immediately. You give it maybe 20, 30 minutes or so of sitting there, and then you wipe it off. Why do you do that? A couple of reasons. First of all, letting it sit will actually cause that initial layer to sort of stain the primer a little bit. And so it'll give you the tone of that initial paint to future layers to at least some degree. Second of all, by wiping it off, you're removing most of it, and so you can have an easier time. Remember, I mentioned the fat over lean thing earlier. You'll have an easier time putting more layers on top of it because you'll have wiped off most of the oil, but you won't be able to wipe it all off unless you use mineral spirits or some other kind of paint remover. And so it's going to leave a very, very thin layer of oil on the surface. And so that sort of acts as a lubricant to your future layers to make it easier to do your blending and that sort of thing. This is referred to in canvas art as alla prima technique, or wet on wet. It's what Bob Ross used to use in his painting show on PBS, years and years ago. And essentially, as I said, what it does is it allows you to just sort of more easily work your other paints on top of it, because it already has a little bit of layer of oil that sort of lubricates what you're working on top of it. So once you've wiped that off, then you're going to overbrush with the main kind of brighter color that you're going to use. Maybe you'd call this your base coat in acrylic painting. I've covered overbrushing before, but just as sort of a reminder, it's similar in terms of how you manage your brush. It's similar to dry brushing, except that you're going to not actually dry the brush off. You're going to get paint on your brush, and you're going to, not too much. You might wipe a little bit off just to make sure you're not loaded too heavily, but you'll get some paint on your brush, and then you'll just sort of wipe it across the highest points of whatever piece you're painting. So you're going to not try to cover the lowest areas. You're going to let your brush catch on the raised areas of the section of miniature that you're painting, and allow that brighter color, or that, like I said, main color, to sort of catch along the edges. Then what you're going to do, now essentially at this point, what you should have is, in your recesses, you'll have that original kind of darker color, and then on the highlights you'll have the brighter color. Then you're going to start your blending, and this is done with a technique called scumbling. Essentially what that is you'll take a clean brush, and it should be dry. You shouldn't have any mineral spirits or anything like that on it. It should be a clean, dry, soft brush. I usually use one that's called a filbert. Basically, it's a flat, rounded, it's a flat brush. It actually looks a little bit like your hand. So it's flat, and it's got rounded edges like that. And what you'll do is you'll sort of tap along the edges of the two paints, where the two paints meet. So there'll be essentially a line between the dark and the lighter colors, and you'll just sort of tap along those edges. And what that essentially does is, if you can imagine, two piles of butter sitting next to each other, right? And as you tap along the edges, it essentially smushes the butter together, right? So that's use your imagination. That's essentially what's happening between this. And so as you tap along the edges, it's going to essentially smush your two colors of oil together, and that's essentially going to cause them to blend. And as you do that more, it'll smooth out the blend more and more. You can also sort of drag the blend one direction or the other by sort of tapping in one direction or the other. So if you tap along the line, it'll sort of do an even blend between the two of them. If you tap starting from the lighter color towards the darker color, it'll sort of bring that lighter color farther into the dark. And if you tap from the darker color into the light, it'll do the opposite. Just as you do that, you want to remember that you need to constantly not constantly, but periodically be cleaning off that brush on a paper towel or something like that, just so you're not building up too much of the paint on that brush itself. You want to keep it as clean as possible. And every now and again, if you're drying it off on your paper towel, and you see that you're still leaving paint on the paper towel no matter how much you dry it or clean it, you might actually want to go ahead and put it into the mineral spirits, clean it off until it's not leaving paint behind, let it air out until the mineral spirits evaporate, and then get back to work. From there, you'll kind of repeat and adjust that technique until you get the color variation that you like. So what I mean by that is you'll keep adding some of the brighter color, or yet another brighter color on top of that if you want to, or adding some of the darker color, or potentially removing some of the colors if you need to, either using scumbling or using a little bit of a sponge or something to wipe up some of the excess paint if you need to, until you get the exact kind of blend and ratio and color transitions that you really like. And then you'll come back and make another panel wash, sort of like we did the last time when we were using oil washes just for doing panel lining. And you'll use that with a nice dark one of whichever color you want to emphasize more, and you'll lay that in as a wash between any of the pieces that you're working with. In our case, we're going to have a yellow robe and we're going to have a blue robe, and I'll lay a darker yellow, kind of an orange brown in between the blue and the yellow robe to sort of give a real nice definition between those two pieces. And that's about it. Thing to remember with oils is that it's really easy to correct mistakes. I would say it's easier than with acrylics, because no matter what happens, all you got to do is wait a little bit and then tap it out with scumbling, and it'll blend right in. And it's really hard to see it after a while. So no matter what you do, you can always fix it. All right, let's see the demo now. We're going to focus the demo today on blending the oils on the robes of the Spiritseer, because I find wet blending to be one of the easiest techniques to get a nice smooth transition of colors on robes and other parts of the model that have to be really, really smooth. And while you can wet blend in acrylics, I find wet blending in oils to be much easier than with acrylics, just because you have that longer working time. So that's what we're going to do here. And as you can see, he's got quite a bit of robes on the model. Need a little bit of white spirit and a little bit of, in this case, ultramarines blue. And we start off, as I mentioned before, with laying down a base coat or an undercoat of oil paints all over the model. And this is just real quick. It can be sloppy, it can be dirty. If you get it over any of the parts of the model that you don't necessarily want to be in oils, it's not a big deal. You can clean it up later with white spirit, it'll come right off. So don't worry about being neat. In my case, I do use a flat brush for this, just because I do want to go ahead and get the hard edges around the raised pieces, like his holster for his pistol there. But like I said, it's not a huge deal if you get it on other things. So go ahead and be quick and messy with it as you go along. Get it in everywhere, rub it in deep, and we'll just try to, like I said, get all the spots that are going to be blue. Now, the one thing I would encourage is the parts of the model that are going to be yellow later on. We're not going to put blue on those, because there is some amount of interaction between the colors. So if I want to put yellow on top of blue, I'm still going to get a little bit of mixing together, and it'll come out a little bit green, which will mean it's going to be slightly harder to get a good, bright yellow without cleaning it off a little bit more. So again, while I can do it, I can correct it. It's just a little bit less work if I keep that part clean. So I want to keep the blue to the blue spots, or the spots that I'm not going to paint yellow, and then I'm going to put a different undercoat on the parts that I'm going to put yellow, which I'll show you here when I get to it. Like I said, it's not a huge deal if I get it on there. It just means I'm going to have to clean it up a little bit first. So I'm just trying to save myself a little bit of work by keeping them separate. And some people do use a little bit of white spirit mixed in with that initial blue. I usually do too, just a little bit. I didn't show it on the video itself, but it can be mixed in just a little bit. You don't want to go too heavy though, because you're not trying to make a wash. You don't want to evaporate, or you don't want to neutralize the oil part of the paint, but you do want to make it thin enough that it flows easily. In this case, I'm adding now a little bit more, because there's going to be parts of the model that I want to go ahead and get into with the paint that I'm not going to come back and paint more of. So this is going to be in between the parts of his Wraithbone armor that just needs to be blue. And so I'm essentially doing what we did in a previous video where we did panel lining. And so I'm making a real thin wash of the blue by mixing that white spirit into the ultramarine blue and using my liner brush. And then we'll zoom in here so you can see that I'm just taking in and letting the capillary action get it in between the parts of the bone armor so that when you look at the front of the model, you'll see the blue robes underneath the armor, and it'll look nice and consistent. Again, if I was going to do this for the undercoat for my wet-on-wet blending, I wouldn't want to put that much white spirit in it, just because it's going to evaporate and it's not going to give me that smooth layer to work with. But in the case of putting it underneath that bone color where I want to just have a nice dark blue, it's fine, because again, I'm not going to use it for blending. I'm just using it for giving myself a backdrop for the armor. Next step, I'm doing a little bit of Indian yellow here, which is really kind of a brownish, orangish yellow, and I'm going to use that as my base coat for the robes. One thing that I was really nervous about when I first started doing oil paints is I was nervous about getting the colors just right, because I know a lot of times when you watch painting videos in acrylic paints, especially when you talk about doing miniature painting, a lot of people get real particular about the recipes they're using. And so I was very concerned about color matching, getting my exact recipe right for the oils and stuff, making sure I get the right type of oil, etc. And what I've since discovered is that it matters an awful lot less, because I end up spending more time just blending and mixing anyway. And so if I get this first layer not exactly right, or even if I get subsequent layers not exactly right, I'm going to wind up pushing paint around anyway and mixing a little bit of this and a little bit of that as I go. And so getting the first color exactly right is just not as important as I used to think it was. So this one, you'll see later in the video that I end up getting the yellow a little bit off, and so it's not a big deal. I just keep working with it until it gets the way I look. In this case, what I've done is I've waited. I put the paints down. I waited about 20 minutes or so. Went and got myself some coffee, chilled out for a bit, and then I came back. And these are just makeup sponges that you can get in any kind of beauty section of your grocery store or your cosmetics counter of your drugstore or whatever. And you just start wiping the paint off. I generally tend to go kind of from a top-down sort of motion. That way, it's more likely to go ahead and get the raised portions and the spots where the sun's striking the model. You can also use, as you might have seen a second ago, I also use some kind of eyeshadow applicators. It's a similar material to the makeup sponge, but it gives you a little bit better control in the harder to reach areas, and you can use those, or you can use sponges that you cut down to smaller size to get into the smaller areas. Once again, you don't want to necessarily wipe off all the paints, but you can wipe off most of it. Even if you think you've wiped it all off, you're going to have a little bit of the oil residue left. And no matter how hard you try, you're not going to get the really, really deep cracks and crevices. But even on the highest surfaces, there's still going to be a little bit of oil residue left for you to provide that, or to have that lubricant for future layers that I mentioned during the intro section. And so as I said, I just kind of work my way around the model, just kind of wiping and wiping as I go, trying to get as much of the initial layer off as I can. As you can see, even on the highest spots, there's a little bit of staining left. That's just because, again, as I mentioned in the intro, some of the oil does get trapped into the primer, into the kind of the spaces between the flecks of paint that have gotten stuck there. So areas now where I end up getting a little bit over oil onto places where I didn't want it, I just go back in with another brush. I did it very quickly, but I did another brush that has a little bit of mineral spirits on, and just kind of cleaned it up real quick. For this next step, I'm just taking some cadmium yellow medium and some more of a darker yellow paint. I don't remember which one I used. I'll have to look it up and I'll tell you during the outro in case you care. But this time I'm kind of pre-mixing a little bit just to sort of get a mid-tone, and I'm doing a little bit of an overbrushing, which is a technique I covered before. It's similar to dry brushing. Get just a little bit of paint on there, and then just kind of drag it across the higher parts of the model. Now, as you look at this, you're going to
think to yourself, like I did when I first started looking at it, wow, that's a huge jump in yellows. I'm going from basically a brown to a bright yellow. It looks weird, and it does, and that's okay though, because what we're going to do is we're going to get it on there, we're going to evaluate whether it's too big of a jump or not, then we're going to start blending. So here I'm just kind of cleaning off the first brush that I used where I was applying the paint, and then I'm going to take a different brush to start blending those two together and scumbling, which I'll show you that technique now. So this is a clean brush, and all I'm doing is sort of tapping along those seams in between the two paints, the kind of browner color and the brighter yellow color. Just kind of tapping along the seam, and I'm trying to bring a little bit more of the darker color into the yellow. If you remember from the intro, I was talking about how you can go from the darker color into the lighter color in order to darken it down, or the lighter color into the darker to brighten it up. You can go in either direction. In this case, I thought the brighter yellow was too bright, so I'm trying to dull it down a little bit by bringing the darker color forward. If you notice, anytime my hand goes off the screen, I'm essentially wiping that brush off onto the paper towel to clean it. And as we go along, you'll notice that the intensity of that yellow comes way, way down, and we start getting a more neutral or more mid-tone kind of yellow from that really super eye-blindingly bright yellow that I put on to begin with. It becomes a little bit more of a mid-tone yellow, because what's happening is I'm essentially mixing paint right there on the model and adjusting it as I go to get to where I want to be. And now in this case I said, well, maybe I went a little bit too much into the brown spectrum, and so I'm now taking some more of the yellow off the high parts and putting it back down into the browner parts to get back into the more yellow. And now I'm taking a little bit more of the brighter yellow, putting it on the highlights. And again, this is a process. You just kind of keep going back and forth and adjusting as you go. If you at any point feel that you're kind of losing the tone that you want or losing the color that you want, you can always introduce another color into the mix. You don't have to just keep going back and forth between the brighter and the darker colors that you started with. You can enter, a different tone into it. You can enter in a completely different color into it if you want to, completely change the tone or completely change the hue or the shade in any way that you want. It's really kind of an experimental process, and that's one of the things I like about it, is that you can just sort of experiment with the colors as you go. And at any point, if you decide you don't like it, you can just come in there with some mineral spirits, pull it off, start over, or pull off in small sections and redo those small sections, etc. Here I am again, just sort of blending as I go. A lot of artists that I've seen do the miniatures with the oil techniques will try to get the colors right before doing the blending with that scumbling technique I talked about. I tend to not do that just because I have a harder time personally visualizing what it's going to look like blended, and so I kind of have to do it as I go. You may be different. You may be able to just work purely off the highest and lowest values, but I personally need to scumble as I go. So I'd say try it out both ways and do whichever one works best for you. And just try to enjoy the technique. Like I said, it's a very experimental technique, and personally I find it pretty relaxing, frankly. It also goes pretty quickly. You'll see the finished model at the end of the video, but what I find is that the oil painting, with the exception of the wait times, I've mentioned it takes longer to dry, so the wait times add into the total time, but my time on brush for oils tends to be a lot less than time on brush for acrylic painting. And I think part of that is that I can be a little more loose with it, I think, because I can adjust, I can remove paint, it's additive, it's subtractive. I can go with a bigger brush to start with, cover a lot more area, and then come back later to fix things. I don't know. I'm not sure exactly the reason, but I do tend to spend less time on oil work than I do on the equivalent size model for acrylic, generally speaking. Again, except for the wait times for things. So this one, for the oil work on here, I'd say it took me maybe an hour, including the wait times. So I probably gave it about a half an hour rest to after that initial coat to let it set before we're doing the wipe off. So all the robes, that includes the yellow part of the robes, that includes the cleaning, that includes the blue robes, altogether that was a half an hour or less, I would say, to get what I think is a pretty smooth blend at the end of the day. And that also includes the fact that I kind of didn't know for sure which colors I wanted to get to. As you can see, I've got 3 different colors of yellow there, and I go over the same section a few times as I'm trying to nail exactly the tone I wanted. So if I'd done this one first and then I moved into an assembly line for other models, it would have gone faster just because I would have known already which colors I wanted to go with and in what order and to what vibrancy and that sort of thing. So again, your mileage may vary, but I would encourage you to give it a try, especially if you have a model you want to blend and get the blend nice and smooth. I apologize for getting this one a little bit off screen. We'll recenter here in a second. There we go. The other thing to remember, as I think I mentioned before, is that you really need very little oil actually going on the model. So every time you see me tapping into that pile of oil over there, I'm getting really just a touch onto the brush and then applying just a very little at a time. One of the things that was kind of a beginner mistake when I first started trying the oils was putting too much onto the model, and then it becomes very difficult to blend because there's just so much to spread around that it's difficult to actually get a balance between 2 colors because there is so much paint on the model at that point that you have to end up removing more than you actually blend. So I would say that, much like with acrylic paints where the mantra is sort of 2 thin coats, with oil paints, similar kind of idea. It's really better to use a lot less than you think you need and then add more as you discover that you didn't put enough on, rather than put too much on and have to figure out how you're going to remove it or how you're going to scrape it off and start over. Similar kind of idea. Robe's getting kind of where I wanted to on the yellows, so transition to blue. And once again, I've got the ultramarine blue is the darker one, and then for the lighter one, I picked a vibrant light blue color that I want to use for the highlights. And here I'm just kind of going through with the ultramarine blue and sort of tapping in just a couple of spots with the darker color to start off in the shadows, and then the lighter color I'm going into the edges of them where I want it to be bright, and just sort of tapping in a few areas there just to get started with. And then once I've done that, I come back with the scumbling brush once again, which you'll see here momentarily, and there we go. And I start working again along the edges to sort of smooth out between those 2 transition spots. In this case, I decided that the brighter color was too dark, and so once again I'm moving from the brighter color is too light, and so once again I'm moving from the shadows and bringing those darker blues out to the lighter blues in order to get an overall darker tone, and bringing my ultramarine more into the pale blue. And again, it's hard to describe, but hopefully you can see me doing it. It's really kind of a tapping motion as you're sort of mashing that oil down from one side to the other, tapping with the side of the bristles. Not the same as stippling where you're sort of going vertical with the brush, but sort of hitting the flat of the brush and tapping along the model with that. If you drag too much instead of tapping, that can also work, but if you're not careful, you can kind of just sort of separate the paint a little bit too much and get a result that doesn't look quite as good. So once again, scumbling involves this kind of tapping motion between the 2 different areas of paint in order to cause them sort of force them to blend with each other. And once again, as with the yellow, anytime you feel like adding a little more paint, you can add a little more paint. In this case, I decided I wanted to edge highlight a little bit along the sleeves and along the edges of the robe to really get a nice bright edge. Even along the bottom, just because why not? I can always darken it later with pigment powders or whatever when I decide to put him a little bit more into his environment. And once again, bringing the darker blue down and then bringing the lighter blue up just to get that right balance of where I want the color transitions to be. In this case, I decided to go with the liner brush because there was a few very small folds along the upper arm sleeves where he's holding his arms up kind of, and so the robe creates, you know, kind of cloth gathering around like the elbows, just under the armor plates and stuff. And so it was fairly hard to reach with any of the other brushes, and so I went in with the liner brush to sort of tap in some highlights along the tops of those folds. And it ended up working out fine. I generally don't like to use a liner brush for anything other than creating fine details or creating the panel lining, but in this case it worked out fine. And the main reason I don't want to do that though is because the scumbling is a technique, because again you're kind of tapping the bristles over and over again, much like when you're dry brushing or much like when you're stippling. It is a little bit hard on a brush, so the one thing I will recommend is to get inexpensive brushes for any of the oil work you do. I have a big packet of hobby brushes from Michaels that I use that is like, I don't know, I think it was $15 for just a big ton of brushes of different sizes and different shapes that I kind of tear through over time. So I recommend going for relatively inexpensive brushes for it, just because, like I said, they do get beat up relatively quickly. But my liner brushes, I try to take care of and not beat them up, so I try not to use them for scumbling. In this case, I didn't really scumble with it, I kind of drew lines with it, but those were areas where I didn't want to make super smooth transitions, because they were areas of kind of the highest highlights. But if I had needed to scumble, I would have tried to not do it with the liner brush, and I would have tried to use it with my little tiny flat brush that I've got there. And here I just kind of looked at it again in the environment, sort of seeing any other areas, cleaned off the brushes again, and then I'm going in there once more in the yellows. I saw a couple of areas where I wanted to touch up some of the edges of transition in between the highest folds, and I went back. And here we go. This is a full rotation of the Spiritseer, so you can see him from start to finish, and you can kind of see where he wound up in terms of the looks. Still working on my overall lightbox setup. Hope you can see it well enough to get a sense of how good the transitions are there. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you stayed to the end. Took me a little time to put that one together, just to get everything just right for you, and I really hope that it came through clearly and that you were able to learn something today. Quick reminder about what I really like about oils. First of all, a little bit goes a long way. Those oil tubes, as I said, kind of last forever, and I get a lot of work done out of them. Second, I really like the long working times, and it's a real strong feature for them. While it does mean that it takes a little bit longer to get some models done in terms of being able to get them on the tabletop, it's not that much longer, an extra day maybe, but having that longer working time really leads to much smoother blends and allows me to correct mistakes for a lot longer if I see myself making any mistakes. The ability to add and subtract is a real game changer. It means that I have a lot more control over
where I put the paint, how much I put the paint on, how thick I want it to be, how much of a transition I want to make, just everything. It's a real game changer. Adds a lot of subtlety and depth to the piece. The fact that I can actually blend the paints on the model, again, you can do that with acrylic paints, but because they dry so quickly, it's much more difficult to do. And so being able to blend it on the model reliably means that I can adjust the colors in the context of the model and in the context of the surrounding paints, which again is kind of a game changer because I can see how they look next to the other things that are already on the model and get the colors just right. And then the last one I'll bring up, and I didn't really show this in this particular model too much, except just that kind of real quick pin wash. But washes with oils in particular are a real game changer. And even if you don't want to do a full oil workflow, I strongly encourage you to try at the very least to do a wash with oils. I had a friend of mine, Scott, over at the house last week, and he's doing an army of Stormcast Eternals for Age of Sigmar. And he's lots of metal on them, lots of gold, lots of silver, and he's been kind of curious about oils for a while, but didn't want to try it on his own. And so I showed him how to mix very simple oil wash with them. It was not a real thin one like a pin wash. It was a little thicker, and so I had him paint up just the base coat of one of his models and asked him to do just a couple little highlights on the non-metal parts. And then I told him just for the metals to go through and do just a very simple black oil wash on it. And then on the skin and leather to do a very simple brown, in this case burnt umber, oil wash on it. And then same technique as I did for the preparatory thing there, where you paint it and then wipe it off. Literally all we did for that, we just did the wash, wiped it off after about a half an hour of waiting. And his comment to me was, word for word, I can't believe how much better this looks with so little effort. So it really is kind of an easy button for getting some really interesting results. And so I encourage you to try it. It's much better than any kind of acrylic wash I've ever done in my life. Anyway, once again, thanks for stopping in and watching the video. And I'd really appreciate any comments or feedback you might have. Let me know how do you make the channel better, and let me know what you like and what you don't like, and what you might see what you might like to see in the future. Have a great day and keep on looting.